Seren hadn't planned on seeing the Alpha King today. She hadn't planned on seeing him ever again. But there he was, standing 40 feet away in the middle of the Thornwall Market Square, surrounded by armed guards and gray-cloaked advisors, his dark coat cutting a sharp line against the pale morning fog. 5 years older, 5 years harder, and still the only man who had ever made her forget how to breathe. Her body recognized him before her mind could catch up. The scent hit first, cedar and iron and something warm beneath it that she had spent years trying to scrub from her memory. Her wolf, dormant and disciplined and carefully starved of everything it once craved, lurched awake beneath her skin with a violence that nearly buckled her knees. No, not now. Seren grabbed the edge of the nearest market stall and steadied herself. Her knuckles went white around the wood. Her pulse was a stampede in her ears, drowning out the chatter of vendors and the clink of coins changing hands. She couldn't move, couldn't think, could only stand there like a deer in torchlight while the world tilted sideways beneath her feet. He hadn't seen her yet. His attention was on the men around him, his jaw set in that hard, unreadable line she remembered too well. The line that meant he was listening but had already decided. The line that meant someone was about to be disappointed. She needed to leave. Right now. Immediately. Before he turned his head, before his gaze swept across the crowd and found her standing there like an idiot with her heart climbing out of her throat, she took one step backward. A small hand tugged her skirt. "Mama, who is that man?" Serene's blood turned to ice. She looked down. Her son stood beside her, his dark curls wild from sleep, his gray eyes, his father's eyes, wide and curious and fixed on the king with an intensity that made her stomach drop through the floor. "Why does he smell like me?" Wynne asked. The words came out clear and bright and impossibly loud in the morning air. A woman at the next stall glanced over. A guard's head turned slightly. Seren dropped to her knees, cupping her son's face with trembling hands. "He doesn't, sweetheart. You're imagining things." But Wynne frowned, unconvinced, and craned his neck to look past her shoulder. "But Mama, he smells exactly like—" Seren scooped him up, pressing his face into her shoulder, and walked. She didn't run. Running would draw attention. She kept her stride even and unhurried and prayed to every god she'd ever heard of that Caedmon Varric, Alpha King of the Northern Reach, did not turn around. He didn't. She made it to the edge of the square, past the fish vendor and the candle maker and the old woman selling dried herbs, and she did not look back. Not once. Her arms trembled around her son. Her wolf howled silently beneath her ribs. Behind her, the king said something to his beta, and the low rumble of his voice carried across the square like distant thunder. Seren's eyes burned, but she didn't cry. She hadn't cried over Caedmon Varric in 3 years, and she wasn't about to start now. Not here. Not with Wynne in her arms, warm and trusting and completely unaware that the man in the market square was the reason they had spent 5 years running. She turned the corner and disappeared into the narrow streets of Thornwall. And behind her, unnoticed, the king paused mid-sentence. His chin lifted slightly, his nostrils flared. Something had shifted in the air. Something familiar. Something he couldn't name. He frowned, scanning the crowd. But whatever it was already gone. 5 years earlier, Seren had been nobody. Not nobody in the poetic, romantic sense. Nobody in the literal sense. An orphan raised in the healer's quarter of Duncarrow Keep, trained to stitch wounds and brew tinctures and stay invisible. She had no family name, no bloodline, no rank. She existed in the margins of the kingdom, useful but unremarkable, the kind of person whose absence would take days to notice. She had been good at being invisible. She had practiced it like a craft. And then Caedmon Varric had looked at her. Not the way a king looks at a healer, a brief, functional glance, before returning to more important matters. He had looked at her like she was the only solid thing in a room full of smoke. Like she had walked into his field of vision and rearranged every molecule in it. She had been 21. He had been 26. Newly crowned, already terrifying, already legendary. The king who had taken the throne by force at 23 when his father's mind had fractured beyond repair. The king who had ended the Ashenmore Rebellion in 9 days. The king whose wolf was so large and so dark that soldiers on both sides of any conflict claimed it blocked out the moon. He had no business looking at a nameless healer the way he looked at her. But he had. And she, foolish and young and so desperately hungry for something she couldn't name, had looked back. What followed was a secret, not a love affair. Love affairs involved candlelit dinners and public declarations and flowers delivered in daylight. What they had was stolen hours in empty corridors, hushed conversations in the archive after midnight, the brush of his fingers against hers beneath the council table where no one could see. He never took her to his bed. She never asked why, but she felt the restraint in him every time they were alone, a held breath. A line he drew and redrew and refused to cross. She assumed it was because she was beneath him, because a king could want a nobody in private but never claim one in public. She had been wrong about the reason, but she hadn't known that until it was too late. The day everything shattered was a Tuesday, ordinary and unremarkable, the kind of day that had no business holding catastrophe. Seren had been crossing the east corridor when she heard voices through the council chamber door, left carelessly ajar. Lady Ravenna Ashcroft's name, mentioned once, twice, then repeatedly, in the mouths of advisors she recognized, words like alliance, bloodline, political union. And then Caedmon's voice, low and resigned, saying something she couldn't quite hear, followed by a sentence she heard perfectly. The arrangement will be announced at the equinox. Seren had pressed herself flat against the stone wall outside the door, her heartbeat so loud she was certain someone would hear it. She had waited until the voices moved deeper into the chamber, and then she had walked away. She didn't confront him. She didn't ask for an explanation. She knew what she'd heard, and she knew what she was. Nobody didn't get to demand answers from the king. 3 days later, she realized she was pregnant. The timing was cruel. Not his child from his bed, because they'd never shared one, but from the one night the restraint had cracked, 6 weeks earlier in the archive, surrounded by books and dust and the smell of old leather, when he had kissed her for the first time and the first time had become everything at once, desperate and clumsy and overwhelming and over far too quickly. He'd held her afterward like she might dissolve, and she'd believed, stupidly, recklessly, that it meant something permanent. It hadn't. Seren left Duncaro Keep the same week. She packed one bag, walked out through the servants' gate before dawn, and never looked back. She told no one, left no note, vanished the way only a nobody could, quietly, completely, without leaving a ripple. She traveled south for 3 weeks, then east, then south again, putting as much distance between herself and the northern reach as her body and her dwindling coin would allow. She found Thornwall by accident, a small market town nestled in the foothills of the Grey March Range, far enough from Duncaro that the king's name was spoken like a rumor rather than a reality. She built a life there, a small one, a healer's cottage on the edge of town with a garden full of chamomile and yarrow, and a door that locked from the inside. She delivered babies and set broken bones and brewed remedies for coughs that wouldn't quit, and the people of Thornwall knew her simply as Seren. No surname, no history, no questions asked. Wynne was born in the dead of winter, during a storm so fierce the midwife almost didn't make it. He arrived screaming, red-faced and furious, with a full head of dark curls and eyes the color of rain-washed stone. His father's eyes. Seren had held him against her chest and made 2 promises. First, that he would never feel unwanted. And second, that Caedmon Varric would never know he existed. She had kept both promises for 4 years. 4 years of building something fragile and precious and entirely her own. 4 years of pretending the hollow ache beneath her ribs was just loneliness and not the ghost of a bond that had never been completed. And now the king was in Thornwall, standing in her market square, breathing the same air she breathed, and her son could smell him. The news spread through Thornwall like fire through dry grass. The Alpha King was here on a border inspection, the first in a decade. Something about disputed territory between the Northern Reach and the Grey March clans. Something about tensions that needed a royal presence to settle before they escalated into bloodshed. He'd be staying a week, maybe more. Seren received this information from Brielle, the baker's wife, and the closest thing she had to a friend, who delivered it breathlessly over the garden fence while wind chased a butterfly in the yard behind them. "A week," Seren repeated, her voice carefully flat. "At least," Brielle confirmed, her eyes bright with the thrill of proximity to power. "They've taken over the Grey March Lodge. Half the town council is falling over themselves trying to arrange a formal welcome. Can you imagine? The king himself, here in Thornwall?" Seren could imagine. That was precisely the problem. "You look pale," Brielle observed. "Are you feeling all right?" "Fine," Seren lied. "Just the heat." It was mid-autumn. Brielle gave her a skeptical look, but mercifully didn't push. After she left, Seren sat on the back step and tried to think clearly through the roaring static in her head. A week. She could survive a week. Thornwall was small, but not that small. The king would be occupied with border negotiations and clan politics. He would have no reason to visit the eastern edge of town where a healer with no surname lived quietly with her son. She just had to stay invisible. She was good at that. She'd practiced. The plan lasted exactly 2 days. On the second morning, a messenger arrived at her door. A young man in the gray livery of the Grey March Lodge, looking harried and slightly out of breath. "Are you the healer?" he asked. "The one they call Seren?" Her stomach clenched. "Who's asking?" "Lord Theron Brask, the king's beta. One of the border delegates has taken ill. Fever and convulsions. The lodge's physician is requesting additional support from local healers." Seren's mouth went dry. "There are other healers in Thornwall. Goodwife Marin on the West Road. Old Petchik near the—" "We've sent for both," the messenger interrupted. "Lord Brask is requesting everyone available. The delegate's condition is serious." Of course it was. Of course the one healer in Thornwall who could not go anywhere near the Grey March Lodge was the one being summoned by name. She could refuse. She could claim illness, feign a broken wrist, lock her door, and hide beneath her bed like a child. But a man was sick. Convulsions meant possible poisoning or brain fever, and both could kill within hours. She was a healer. This was what she did. Her conscience and her survival instinct went to war. Her conscience won in 4 seconds. "Give me 10 minutes," she said. She left Wynne with Brielle, who accepted the arrangement with a cheerful wave and a promise of honey cakes. Seren kissed her son's forehead, lingering a beat longer than usual, and tried not to think about why her hands were shaking. "Be good," she told him. "I'm always good," Wynne replied with the serene confidence of a 4-year-old who had never once been good. The walk to Grey March Lodge took 20 minutes. Each step felt like walking toward an open flame. The lodge was an old stone building on the northern edge of town, 3 stories of gray rock and dark timber that had served as a meeting hall for the border clans for generations. Today, it bristled with armed guards and the banners of the Northern Reach. Seren kept her head down and her hood up as she approached. A guard checked her name against a list and waved her through the gate. She crossed the courtyard with her shoulders hunched, making herself small, praying she wouldn't see. "Ah, you must be the healer from the eastern quarter." The voice came from her left. Deep, measured, and utterly unfamiliar. Seren turned and found herself face to face with a tall, broad-shouldered man with close-cropped brown hair and sharp hazel eyes. His bearing was military. His expression was polite but assessing, the look of someone who catalogued threats by habit. "Lord Theron Brask," he said, extending a hand. "The King's Beta. Thank you for coming so quickly." Seren shook his hand and hoped he couldn't feel her pulse hammering through her fingers. "Where is the patient?" Theron led her inside, through corridors that smelled of old stone and beeswax, past closed doors where she could hear the low murmur of voices conducting the business of border politics. Her wolf was frantic beneath her skin, pacing, whining, straining toward a scent that grew stronger with every step deeper into the lodge. "He's here. He's close." She clenched her jaw and focused on the floor in front of her feet. One step. Another. Another. Theron stopped at a door on the second floor and pushed it open. The sick room was dim, curtains drawn against the morning light. The delegate, a heavy-set man in his 50s with the ruddy complexion of the mountain clans, lay in the bed, his skin ashen and slick with sweat. His breathing was shallow and irregular. Goodwife Marin was already there, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead with the steady competence of a woman who had been healing longer than Seren had been alive. "Brain fever," Marin said without looking up. "Started last night. Convulsions have stopped for now, but his temperature is still climbing." Seren set down her bag and went to work. This, at least, she could do. This, at least, made sense. She checked his pulse, examined his eyes, felt the heat radiating from his skin. She mixed a draught of white willow, elderflower, and a careful measure of foxglove for his heart, which was racing too fast. For 30 minutes, she existed only as a healer. The fear receded. Her hands steadied. The work was familiar and grounding and exactly what she needed to remember who she was now, not the girl who had run from the king, but the woman who had built something from nothing. Then the door opened behind her. She didn't need to turn around. Her body knew. Every nerve ending fired at once. The scent of cedar and iron flooded the room, and her wolf slammed against her ribcage so hard she nearly gasped. "How is he?" Caedmon asked. His voice, low and quiet and close. The years hadn't changed it, hadn't dulled a single edge. Marin answered. Seren couldn't hear what she said over the roaring in her ears. She kept her back to the door, kept her hands moving, kept her eyes on the patient. "Don't turn around. Don't turn around. Don't." "And the other healer?" Caedmon said. "Your assessment?" He was speaking to her. Serene's hands stilled on the compress. The room contracted to the sound of his breathing behind her. She could feel him waiting, could feel the weight of his attention settling on her back like a hand pressed between her shoulder blades. She turned. Their eyes met, and the world stopped. 5 years. All of it spent running, rebuilding, teaching herself to live without the gravitational pull of this man. Convincing herself she had imagined the intensity, exaggerated the connection, romanticized something that had been nothing more than a powerful man's passing interest in a convenient girl. All of it collapsed in the space of a single heartbeat. He looked the same. Older, yes. The lines around his eyes were deeper, the set of his jaw harder, the shadows beneath his cheekbones more pronounced. But the eyes were the same. Dark gray, storm-colored, unreadable, and right now, looking at her with an expression she couldn't decode. Did he recognize her? His brow furrowed. Something flickered behind his eyes, quick and sharp, there and gone. He opened his mouth. "The fever should break by evening," Seren said, turning back to the patient before he could speak. Her voice came out steady. "A miracle. I've administered willow bark and elderflower. He'll need monitoring through the night." A pause, long enough to make her skin prickle. "Very well," Caedmon said. His voice was strange, tight, controlled in a way that suggested the control was costing him something. He left. The door closed. Seren exhaled so hard her vision blurred. Marin looked at her. "You all right, dear? You've gone white as milk." "Fine," Seren managed. "Just the heat." It was the second time in 2 days she'd used that excuse, and the room was freezing. The delegate's fever broke at midnight, just as Seren had predicted. She spent the evening at his bedside, adjusting his dosage, cooling his skin with damp cloths, and trying very hard not to think about the fact that Caedmon Varek was somewhere in this building, separated from her by nothing more than stone walls and years of silence. She failed completely. Her wolf wouldn't settle. It paced and whined and pressed against her skin like an animal trying to claw its way out of a cage. The incomplete bond, the one she had severed by leaving, the one she had told herself would fade and die with distance and time, was very much alive. It throbbed behind her ribs like a second heartbeat, pulling her toward the door, toward the corridor, toward him. She ignored it. She was very practiced at ignoring it. By the time the delegate's breathing had steadied into something resembling natural sleep, Seren was exhausted. She packed her supplies, thanked Marin, and slipped out of the sick room into the darkened corridor. The lodge was quiet. Most of the household had retired hours ago. Torches burned low in their brackets, casting long shadows across the stone floor. Seren moved quickly, keeping close to the wall, her footsteps soft. She made it to the staircase before the voice stopped her. "I know you." Seren froze. Her hand tightened on the banister. She didn't turn around, not immediately, because she needed one more second. One more second of pretending this wasn't happening. "You were at Dunkero." She turned. Caedmon stood at the far end of the corridor, half in shadow, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. He was still dressed, still wearing his boots. And there was something about his posture, too still, too deliberate, that told her he hadn't stumbled upon her by accident. He'd been waiting. "Your Majesty," she said. Her voice held. Barely. He pushed off the wall and took a step closer, then another. Each footfall echoed in the empty corridor, and Seren's heart hammered harder with each one. "Seren," he said. The sound of her name in his mouth after all that silence hit her like a physical blow. She felt it in her stomach, in the backs of her knees. "You remember," she said, and immediately wished she hadn't, because it came out too soft, too vulnerable, too much like the girl she'd been at 21. Something passed across his face, quick and unguarded and gone before she could name it. "I remember," he repeated, and his voice dropped into something rough and low that made her skin prickle. "You left." Not a question. An accusation. Seren straightened her spine. "I did." "No note," he continued, stepping closer. "No explanation, no word to anyone. You simply vanished." "Yes?" "I searched for you." Each word landed clipped and controlled, placed with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this conversation 1,000 times and was still furious. "For months. I sent men to every village, every town, every healer's cottage between Dunkero and the southern coast." Seren's breath caught. He'd searched for her. She hadn't known that. She had assumed, had convinced herself, that he'd barely noticed her absence, that she'd been a minor inconvenience, a loose thread quickly forgotten in the weave of his kingship. "I didn't know," she whispered, "because you didn't stay long enough to find out." He was close now, close enough that she could see the tension in his jaw, the way a muscle jumped beneath the skin. Close enough to smell him properly, the full force of his scent wrapping around her like arms, like warmth, like coming home after years in the cold. Her wolf keened. She swallowed hard against the sound rising in her throat. "Why did you leave?" he demanded. The question she'd been dreading for 5 years, the one she'd prepared a dozen answers for, all of them partial, all of them designed to protect the parts of the truth she couldn't afford to expose. "Because I overheard your counsel discussing Lady Ravenna Ashcroft," Seren said, meeting his eyes. "The political union, the announcement at the equinox. I heard you agree to it." Something shifted in his expression. The anger didn't disappear, but something else moved beneath it. Something that looked, impossibly, like pain. "You heard wrong," he said quietly. The words landed like a stone in still water. Seren stared at him. "What?" "I refuse the arrangement," Caedmon said. "That's what you heard. The council proposed. I declined. I told them the equinox announcement would be a refusal, not an acceptance." The corridor tilted. Seren pressed her hand against the wall to steady herself. "That's not possible. I heard you say—" "You heard a fragment," he interrupted, his voice rough. "Out of context. Through a door. And instead of asking me, you ran." The accusation was sharp enough to cut, and it cut because it was true. She had run. She hadn't asked. She hadn't trusted him enough. Or maybe she hadn't trusted herself enough. Hadn't believed she deserved clarification. Hadn't believed a king would choose a nobody over a political alliance. Hadn't believed she was worth choosing. "I was afraid," Seren said, and the honesty of it burned coming out. "I was nobody. I had no claim on you, no right to demand answers. And I was—" She stopped herself. The word pregnant hovered on her tongue, dangerous and enormous and absolutely impossible to say in this corridor at midnight with his eyes boring into hers. "You were what?" Caedmon asked. "I was young," she finished, "and stupid. And I thought I was doing the right thing." His jaw worked. She watched the anger and the hurt and something else, something raw and hungry, war across his face. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in that archive, the way that had started all of this, like she was the only solid thing in a room full of smoke. "You should have asked me," he said. "I know." Silence fell between them, thick and loaded and vibrating with everything unsaid. Seren could feel the bond pulsing between them, alive and demanding, and she knew he could feel it too. She could see it in the way his hands clenched at his sides, in the way his breathing had gone shallow, in the way his gaze kept dropping to her mouth and snapping back up like he was fighting a losing battle. "I should go," Seren said, though every cell in her body screamed against the words. Caedmon didn't move, didn't step aside. He stood between her and the staircase, close enough to touch, and looked at her with those impossible gray eyes. "Where have you been?" he asked, and the fury had drained from his voice, leaving something raw and exposed beneath it. "5 years, Seren." "Where did you go?" "Here," she said. "Thornwall. I've been here the whole time." Something cracked behind his expression. She saw it happen, a fracture running through the composure he wore like armor, and for one terrible, beautiful moment, the king disappeared and there was only the man who had held her in a dusty archive and kissed her like she was oxygen. The man who had searched for her and failed, and had to live with not knowing. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. He reached for her. His hand rose, hovered near her face, fingers trembling with restraint. She held perfectly still, not breathing, not blinking, waiting for contact that would undo everything she had spent years constructing. His fingertips brushed her cheekbone, the lightest touch. Barely there. The bond detonated. Heat flooded through her, golden and consuming, and she heard him inhale sharply, felt his hand jerk back like he'd touched a flame. His eyes went wide, his pupils dilated until the gray was nearly swallowed by black. He felt it. He felt everything. "Seren," he breathed, and her name in his mouth was a different thing entirely now. Not an accusation, a revelation. Footsteps echoed from the floor below. Voices. Guards changing shift. The spell shattered. Seren stepped back, her heart slamming against her ribs. Caedmon's hand dropped to his side. The mask slid back into place, but she could see the effort it cost him, could see the fine tremor in his jaw, the rapid rise and fall of his chest. "This isn't finished," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a statement. It was a promise, and a warning, and the most dangerous thing anyone had ever said to her. Seren turned and fled down the staircase before he could see the tears burning in her eyes. She made it home in 12 minutes. Brielle had long since fallen asleep on the settee with Wynne curled against her side, his dark curls spread across the cushion, his small mouth slightly open, his father's face in miniature. Seren stood in the doorway and stared at her son, and felt the full, crushing weight of everything she hadn't told the king settle onto her shoulders like a stone. He'd searched for her. He'd refused the arrangement. He'd been waiting in that corridor tonight like a man who had been waiting for 5 years and couldn't wait another hour. And she hadn't told him about Wynne. She pressed her back against the wall, slid to the floor, and for the first time in 3 years, Seren cried. The delegate improved steadily over the next 2 days. Seren visited the lodge each morning to check his progress, adjust his remedies, and leave before the corridors filled with the king's retinue. She arrived early, worked quickly, and kept her hood up, a ghost with a medicine bag. Caedmon did not appear again. She told herself she was relieved. On the 3rd day, Brielle's eldest daughter broke her collarbone falling from a cart, and Brielle sent a frantic message that she couldn't take Wynne. Goodwife Marin was already at the lodge. Old Petchik was 3 miles outside of town treating a farmer's wife who'd gone into labor early. There was no one else. Seren stood in her cottage, her bag packed, her son eating porridge at the table, and felt the walls closing in. "You're coming with me today," she told him, keeping her voice light. "But you need to listen carefully. We're going somewhere important, and I need you to stay quiet and stay close. Can you do that?" Wynne looked up from his porridge with his father's eyes, solemn and far too perceptive for a 4-year-old. "Will the man who smells like me be there?" Seren's stomach dropped. "Maybe. But we're not going to talk to him. We're going to do our work and come straight home." "Why can't I talk to him?" "Because he's your father. Because one look at your face would tell him everything. Because I am barely holding this together and you asking innocent questions is going to be the thing that finally destroys me. Because he's very busy and very important," Seren said. "And we don't bother busy, important people." Wynne considered this with the gravity of a tiny philosopher. "What if he talks to me first?" "He won't." He did. It happened in the courtyard. Seren had settled Wynne on a bench near the kitchen garden with strict instructions to stay put, a picture book, and a bread roll the cook had given him. She'd gone inside to check the delegate, who was sitting up now and complaining about the food, which meant he was recovering nicely. She was gone 15 minutes. When she came back outside, her heart stopped. Wynne was no longer on the bench. He was standing at the edge of the courtyard, his picture book abandoned, watching a group of the King's Guard run through training drills, and beside him, crouched down to the boy's eye level with one arm resting on his knee, was Caedmon. Seren couldn't hear what they were saying. She stood frozen in the doorway, her legs refusing to work, and watched the King of the Northern Reach talk to her son. Wynne was animated. His hands moved as he spoke, gesturing at the guards with the enthusiasm of a child who had never seen real swords before. Caedmon was listening, actually listening, his head tilted slightly, his expression unguarded in a way Seren had rarely seen. There was something almost gentle in the way he watched the boy speak. Then Wynne laughed at something, bright and ringing and fearless, and Caedmon smiled. The breath left Seren's body. She had never seen him smile like that, not in all the months of stolen corridors and midnight archives. Not once. It was a real smile, unforced and warm, and it cracked his face open and made him look younger, softer, like a man who existed outside the weight of his crown. and he was giving it to his son, who he didn't know was his son. And the beauty and the cruelty of that moment collided in Serene's chest with enough force to make her vision blur. She moved, crossed the courtyard in quick, measured strides, her healer's composure bolted into place like armor. "Win!" she called. "Time to go." Both of them looked up. Win beamed at her. "Mama, this is the king. He says his guards practice every morning and he let me hold a real scabbard." "That was very kind of him," Seren said, not looking at Caedmon. "Say thank you and come along." "Thank you, Your Majesty," Win recited obediently. Seren reached for his hand. Her fingers closed around his small, warm ones, and she turned to leave. "Your son," Caedmon said behind her. She stopped. The words vibrated through her like a struck bell. "He's very bright," Caedmon continued, and his voice was careful, deliberate, weighted with something she couldn't identify. "How old is he?" "Don't answer honestly. Lie. Say 3, say 6. Say anything other than the number that would make him count backward and arrive at a date that would ruin everything." "He's 4, Seren said, because she had never been able to lie to him, and she hated herself for it. Silence. 1 beat. 2. She could feel his gaze on the back of her neck. Could feel the calculations happening behind those storm-colored eyes. "He has unusual eyes," Caedmon said quietly. "The color. It's quite distinctive." Every nerve in her body went rigid. "He gets them from his grandmother," she said, the lie coming out smooth and automatic, a lie she had practiced and perfected and delivered to every curious neighbor and midwife and stranger who had ever looked at her brown-eyed face and then at her gray-eyed son and wondered. She didn't wait for his response. She pulled Win across the courtyard, through the gate, and out into the street, walking fast enough that the boy had to trot to keep up. "Mama, you're squeezing my hand too tight." "Sorry, sweetheart." She loosened her grip but didn't slow down. "The king was nice," Win said. "He smells like the forest, and like something warm. He smells safe." Seren pressed her free hand against her mouth and kept walking. Behind them, in the courtyard, Caedmon Varric stood motionless. His smile had vanished. His eyes were fixed on the gate through which the healer and her gray-eyed son had disappeared, and something was working behind his expression. Something slow and relentless and sharp-edged that hadn't fully formed yet but was very, very close. He turned to find Theron standing 3 paces behind him, watching. "The boy," Caedmon said. Theron's expression was carefully blank. "What about him?" Caedmon stared at his beta for a long moment. Then he shook his head and walked away without answering. But that night, he didn't sleep. The unraveling began on the 5th morning. Seren woke to pounding on her door, urgent and insistent, before the sun had cleared the tree line. She stumbled out of bed, heart already racing, and opened the door to find Theron Brask standing on her step. His face told her everything she needed to know before he opened his mouth. "The king requests your presence at the lodge," Theron said. His voice was calm, but his eyes held a warning. "Immediately." "The delegate is recovering well. He doesn't need—" "This isn't about the delegate." The words dropped like a blade. Seren stood in her doorway, barefoot, her hair undone, and felt the ground beneath her feet begin to crumble. "Does he know?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Theron didn't answer. He didn't need to. She dressed in silence, kissed Win's sleeping forehead, and left him with a hastily summoned Brielle. The walk to the lodge felt like walking toward her own execution. Each step was heavier than the last. Her wolf whined beneath her skin, not with longing this time, but with dread. The guards let her through without a word. Theron led her not to the delegate's room, but to a private study on the 3rd floor. He opened the door, gestured her inside, and closed it behind her. He did not follow her in. Caedmon was standing by the window, his back to her. The morning light outlined him in pale gold, and she could see the rigid tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the window ledge hard enough to whiten his knuckles. "Your Majesty," Seren began. "Don't." The word was quiet and savage. He didn't turn around. "Don't call me that. Not right now." Seren's mouth closed. She stood in the center of the room, her hands pressed together in front of her, and waited. When he finally turned, his face destroyed her. He wasn't angry. Or rather, he was. But the anger was the topmost layer, a thin shell stretched over something vast and deep and wounded. His eyes were red-rimmed. His jaw was locked so tight she could see the muscles spasming beneath his skin. "He's mine," Caedmon said. Not a question. Seren opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, had rehearsed explanations, justifications, defenses, and now that it was here, every single one of them dissolved like smoke. "The eyes," Caedmon continued, his voice a controlled, terrible thing. "The age. The scent. I couldn't place it in the market square, but I can now. He smells like Pack. He smells like me." He swallowed. "He's mine, and you kept him from me for 5 years." "Caedmon!" His composure cracked. The sentence tore out of him raw and jagged, edged with a grief so deep it stole the air from the room. 5 years of his life, his first steps, his first words, his first... He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and turned away, his chest heaving. "Did you think I wouldn't want him? Did you think I would turn away my own child? I thought you were marrying someone else." The words tore out of her, louder than she intended, rougher, soaked in years of buried fear. "I thought you were taking a political mate, and I was just the nobody healer you amused yourself with in the dark. I thought if I told you, you would take him from me and I would have nothing. Nothing." Her voice broke on the last word. She could feel tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused them. Not now. Not here. Caedmon stared at her. The anger and the anguish warred across his face like storms colliding. "So, instead of asking me," he said slowly, "you decided for both of us. You decided I was the kind of man who would steal a child from its mother. You decided I would choose politics over..." He stopped. His throat worked. "Over you." The silence that followed was the worst silence of Seren's life. "I was wrong," she whispered. "I know that now. I've known it for years. But by the time I understood, I had built a life. Wynn had a home. And I was afraid that if I came back, if I told you, everything I'd built would be torn apart. I was afraid you'd hate me. I don't hate you." The confession sounded like it had been ripped from somewhere deep inside him. "That's the worst part. I should hate you. I have spent 5 years searching for you, wondering if you were dead, if you were hurt, if something terrible had happened, imagining every possible horror because the alternative, that you left by choice, was worse." His voice dropped. "And I don't hate you. I can't. And I am so angry about that." Serene's tears fell. She couldn't stop them anymore. "I need to meet him," Caedmon said. "Properly, as his father. I know. And I need time." He moved to the desk and pressed his palms flat against the surface, his head bowed, his breathing measured and deliberate. "I need time to be angry. I need time to grieve what I missed, and I need you to not be here while I do that." The words were a blade, but they were honest, and Seren respected honesty even when it cut. "How much time?" she asked. He didn't answer. "Caedmon." "I don't know." He looked up at her, and the rawness in his face made her chest cave inward. "I don't know, Seren. I've never done this before. No one teaches you how to learn you have a son you've never held." She wanted to cross the room, wanted to wrap her arms around him and press her face into his chest, and tell him she was sorry until the word lost all meaning. But he had asked for distance, and she owed him that much. "I'll be at the cottage," she said, "whenever you're ready." She turned to leave. Her hand was on the door handle when his voice stopped her. "What's his name?" The question was so quiet, so fragile, so fundamentally a father's question that Serene's composure shattered entirely. "Win," she said through the tears she could no longer control. "His name is Win." She heard the sharp intake of breath behind her, felt the pulse of something through the bond, agonizing and tender, grief and wonder tangled together until they were indistinguishable. She left before the sound of it broke her completely. The days that followed were the loneliest of Serene's life. No message came from the lodge. No guard appeared at her door. No Theron, no summons, no word at all. The silence was absolute, and it was unbearable. Her body responded before her mind could rationalize. The bond, stirred violently awake by their proximity and now starved of contact, began to pull. Not gently, not subtly. It pulled like a hand fisted in her ribcage, dragging her towards something she couldn't reach. The headaches returned, worse than before. Blinding, nauseating pressure behind her eyes that forced her into darkened rooms. Her appetite vanished. Sleep became a shallow, restless thing that left her more exhausted than wakefulness. Wynne noticed. Of course Wynne noticed. "Mama, you're sad," he said on the third night, crawling into her lap and pressing his small hands against her cheeks. "Your eyes look broken." "I'm just tired, sweetheart." "Is it because of the forest man?" Serene blinked. "The forest man?" "The king. He smelled like the forest." Wynne frowned, his small brow furrowed in concentration. "I dream about forests sometimes. Big dark ones. And something is howling." "Is the forest man howling, Mama?" Serene pulled her son against her chest and held him so tightly he squirmed. "Maybe," she whispered into his hair. "Maybe he is." On the fourth night, she woke gasping from a dream she couldn't remember, her skin damp with sweat, the bond screaming beneath her sternum like a living thing. She stumbled to the window and looked out into the darkness. A wolf stood at the edge of the tree line, massive, black as ink, utterly still, watching her, her hand pressed flat against the cold glass. The wolf didn't move. Its eyes caught the moonlight and threw it back, silver and familiar and filled with something that looked, impossibly, like sorrow. "Cade Mun," she breathed. The wolf turned and vanished into the trees. Serene stood at the window until dawn, shivering, waiting for him to come back. He didn't. On the fifth day, Theron came. Serene was in the garden, pretending to weed while Wynne built a fortress out of sticks nearby. She looked up at the sound of the gate and found the beta standing on the path, his expression carrying the particular weight of a man who had been keeping too many secrets for too long. "May I sit?" he asked. She gestured to the bench. He sat, clasped his hands between his knees, and stared at the ground for a long moment before speaking. "There's something you need to know," Theron said carefully. "About the day you left Duncaro." Serene's hands stilled on the weeds. "I already know what happened. I overheard the council. I drew the wrong conclusion. It's my fault." "No," Theron said. "It isn't." She looked at him. His jaw was tight, his hazel eyes shadowed with something that looked like guilt. "You were meant to overhear that conversation," he said. The words didn't make sense. Serene stared at him, turning them over in her mind, waiting for them to assemble into something comprehensible. "What?" "Aldrich Voss, the king's senior counselor. He engineered it." Theron's voice was low and precise. "He wanted the Ashcroft alliance. Ravenna's family controlled the eastern trade routes, and Voss had significant financial interests tied to those routes. He needed the marriage to happen." Seren felt something cold settle into her stomach. He knew about us? He suspected? He watched? And when he became certain, he arranged for that particular council discussion to take place at a time and location where you would be passing. Theron paused. He made sure the door was open. He made sure the conversation was framed in a way that sounded like acceptance rather than refusal. He knew you would run. The garden seemed to tilt. Seren gripped the edge of the raised bed, her knuckles white, and tried to breathe. You were not paranoid, Theron continued, his voice gentler now. You were not foolish. You were a young woman who heard exactly what someone wanted you to hear, and you reacted exactly the way he predicted. How long have you known? Seren asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Theron hesitated. I confirmed it 2 years ago. Voss made a mistake, mentioned something he shouldn't have in a private meeting. I investigated. 2 years. Her voice went flat. You've known for 2 years, and you didn't find me. I tried. I searched. When the king's search failed, I continued on my own. But you covered your tracks extremely well, Seren. It wasn't until the king arrived in Thornwall and I saw you at the lodge that He stopped, swallowed. I should have found you sooner. I'm sorry. Does Caedmon know about Voss? Theron's silence was answer enough. Tell me, Seren insisted. I told him last night, after he asked me to investigate your claims about the council meeting. He wanted to understand how you could have misheard so completely. Theron's expression tightened. He didn't take it well. What does that mean? Aldrich Voss is currently confined to a cell beneath the lodge, awaiting formal charges of treason against the crown. Seren closed her eyes. The fury and the relief and the grief crashed together inside her, a wave so large she couldn't tell which emotion was which. All those years. The guilt and the loneliness and the self-blame, and none of it had been her fault. She hadn't misheard. She hadn't been stupid or paranoid or unworthy of the truth. She had been played. And so had Caedmon. Where is he now? Seren asked. The lodge. His chambers. He hasn't come out since I told him. Theron looked at her steadily. He needs you, Seren. He won't say it. He'll probably try to send you away again. But he needs you. Seren stood up, brushed the soil from her knees, and turned to look at her son. Wynne was crouched over his stick fortress, carefully placing a leaf on top as a roof. So small, so perfect, so utterly unaware that the ground beneath his world was shifting. Brielle, Seren called over the fence. Can you take Wynne for the evening? Brielle appeared in her doorway, took one look at Seren's face and nodded without asking questions. Bless that woman. Seren kissed Wynne's forehead. I'll be back before you wake up. Promise? Promise. She walked to the lodge in the dying light. The guards at the gate recognized her now and let her through without checking the list. She climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, her pulse hammering louder with each step, and stopped outside the door to his chambers. She knocked once. Leave me. Caedmon's voice, muffled and rough. It's me, Seren said. Silence. Long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer at all. Then the sound of footsteps, and the door opened. He looked wrecked. His hair was disheveled, his shirt untucked, his eyes raw. There was a shattered glass on the floor behind him and a dent in the plaster wall that hadn't been there before. Theron told me about Voss, she said. His jaw clenched. You shouldn't be here. You keep saying that, and I keep coming back. So maybe you should stop saying it. Something flickered in his expression, surprise or admiration or exhaustion so deep it had worn through every defense. He stepped aside. She walked in. The room was a mess. Papers scattered across the desk, a chair overturned, the curtains pulled shut against the last of the daylight. It smelled like him, intensely, overwhelmingly, like he'd been pacing this room for hours, his scent saturating every surface. He took you from me, Caedmon said, his back to her, his voice scraped raw. Voss. He took you from me, and he took 5 years of my son's life, and he did it for trade routes. For money. His hands clenched. I trusted him. He sat at my council table for a decade, and his voice broke. Seren watched his shoulders shake and felt something inside her own chest crack wide open. Caedmon. I could have had you. He turned to face her, and his eyes were wet. I could have had both of you. All this time. Every morning. Every night. Every single day that I spent wondering where you were. Whether you were alive. Whether you... He pressed his fist against his mouth and closed his eyes. Seren crossed the room. She didn't hesitate. Didn't wait for permission. Didn't give him the chance to retreat. She took his face in her hands, stood on her toes, and pressed her forehead against his. You have me now, she said. I'm here. I'm not leaving. His hands came up and wrapped around her wrists, not pulling her away but holding on, gripping her like she might vanish if he let go. And Win, she whispered. You have Win. He's brave and stubborn and ridiculously clever, and he has your temper and your eyes, and he dreamed about you before he ever met you. He dreamed about a forest and something howling. Caedmon made a sound she had never heard from him before, low and broken and raw, something between a laugh and a sob. His forehead dropped against hers and his tears fell against her wrists. I want to know everything, he said. Every day I missed. Every word. Every step. Every single thing. Then stay, Seren said. Stay and I'll tell you. All of it. He kissed her. Not like the archive. Not desperate and clumsy and stolen. This kiss was slow, deliberate. A man choosing something with his whole chest, pressing the choice into her mouth like a vow. She kissed him back and felt the bond between them flare so bright it burned behind her eyelids, golden and enormous, demanding completion. I'm not going to stop, he murmured against her lips. I don't want you to stop. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his gray eyes searching her face. Are you sure? Because if we do this, if we complete the bond... I've been sure for 5 years, Seren said. I was sure when I left, and I was sure every single day after. I was just too afraid to come back. His hand slid into her hair, tilting her face up. No more running. No more running. He kissed her again, deeper, and she felt all those years of distance and silence and grief dissolve between them like frost in sunlight. She leaned into him, and he pulled her closer, and the distance that had separated them for so long simply ceased to exist. What followed was quiet and unhurried. Years of longing finally given permission to land. 2 people who had been torn apart choosing with full hearts and open eyes to come back together. There was nothing frantic about it. It was aching and deliberate, each moment held like something precious that might be taken away again. When the bond completed, it didn't snap. It bloomed. Warm and golden and vast, filling every hollow place inside her, connecting her to him so completely that she could feel his heartbeat in her own chest. The claiming was mutual and certain and exactly right. Afterward, he held her close, his arms wrapped around her, his face buried in her hair. Win, he said quietly. Tomorrow, Seren whispered. I'll bring him tomorrow. You can meet him properly. She felt him nod against her hair, felt the emotion roll through him, through the bond, enormous and overwhelming, and shot through with something fragile and new. Hope. They lay together in the dark, the bond humming between them. For the first time in 5 years, Seren's wolf was quiet, settled, at peace. Caedmon's breathing deepened. His arms loosened slightly, the heavy, slack warmth of a body surrendering to sleep. Seren watched him in the fading firelight and felt tears slide silently down her cheeks, not from sadness, from the staggering, improbable relief of finally being exactly where she was supposed to be. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her. And in a small cottage on the edge of Thornwall, Wynne sat up in bed, wide awake. He looked toward the window, toward the distant lodge, and smiled. The forest man stopped howling. He whispered to no one. Then he lay back down, pulled his blanket to his chin, and slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. Morning came soft and golden through the lodge windows. Seren woke first, still tucked against Cadman's chest, the bond humming warm and steady between them like a second pulse. She lay still for a moment, letting herself feel it. The completeness, the absence of ache, the simple, staggering fact of his heartbeat beneath her ear. Then the weight of what today held settled over her, and the peace gave way to a quiet, creeping dread. Today, Cadman would meet his son. Not the accidental encounter in the courtyard. Not the brief, unknowing exchange between a king and a curious child. Today, Wynne would learn who the forest man really was, and Cadman would have to stand in front of a 4-year-old boy and try to become a father to a child who had never had one. Seren had no idea how either of them would handle it. Cadman was already awake when she lifted her head. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, and there was a tension in his jaw that hadn't been there when he fell asleep. "You're nervous," she said. His gaze shifted to her. "I've led armies into battle. I've negotiated with warlords who wanted me dead. I've held the Northern Reach together through 2 succession crises and a famine." He paused. "I have never been more terrified than I am right now." Seren pressed her lips together to keep from smiling, because his fear was genuine and she didn't want to diminish it. But there was something unbearably tender about the most powerful man in the kingdom being undone by the prospect of meeting a small boy who liked stick fortresses and bread rolls. "He's going to love you," she said. "You don't know that." "I do, because he already does." She sat up, pulling the sheet around her shoulders. "He's dreamed about you for months. He sensed you in the market square before he ever saw your face. His wolf knows, Cadman. It's known from the beginning." Something moved behind his eyes. Fear, still, but beneath it, a cautious, fragile flicker of hope that made her throat tighten. "What if I do it wrong?" he asked, and the question was so quiet, so stripped of pretense, that it barely sounded like him at all. "You will," Seren said honestly. "You'll do 100 things wrong. So will I. That's what parenting is. You just keep showing up." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out, cupped her face, and kissed her forehead with a tenderness that made her eyes sting. "Let's go," he said. They walked to the cottage together. No guards, no retinue. Just the king and the healer, side by side on the dirt road that wound through the eastern quarter of Thornwall, the morning mist curling around their ankles. Seren noticed him adjusting his coat 3 times, running a hand through his hair twice, and stopping once to examine his own reflection in a rain puddle before catching himself and looking mortified. She took his hand. He held on like a man gripping a lifeline. Brielle had Wynne ready. The boy was sitting on the front step in his cleanest shirt, his dark curls still damp from being wrestled into submission with a comb. He looked up when they approached, and his gray eyes went wide. "The forest man," he whispered. Seren knelt in front of her son, taking both his small hands in hers. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. "Wynne, do you remember when you asked me why the king smelled like you?" Wynne nodded slowly, his gaze flickering between Seren and the tall, rigid figure standing behind her. "I didn't tell you the truth that day," Seren said, and her voice wavered despite every effort to hold it steady. "He smells like you because he's your father." The word landed in the morning air and hung there, enormous and irreversible. Wynne stared at her. Then he looked up at Cadman, his small face cycling through emotions too complex for a 4-year-old and too honest to hide. Confusion, curiosity, And then something that made Seren's breath catch, a flicker of hurt. "Why wasn't he here before?" Wynne asked. The question was a knife, clean and precise, and aimed at the exact wound that both adults carried. Seren opened her mouth, but Caedmon stepped forward. He lowered himself to one knee in front of his son, the king of the Northern Reach, kneeling in the dirt outside a healer's cottage, bringing himself to eye level with a boy who barely reached his chest. "Because I didn't know about you," Caedmon said, and his voice was raw but steady, the voice of a man who had decided that honesty was the only currency this moment would accept. "Your mother and I were separated before you were born. It wasn't her fault, and it wasn't yours. Someone kept us apart on purpose, and by the time we found each other again, you had already grown into this extraordinary person that I've never had the chance to know." Wynne studied him with that unsettling 4-year-old gravity. "Are you going to leave again?" "No." "Promise?" Caedmon's voice thickened. "I promise. On my life, on my crown, on everything I am. I'm not leaving." Wynne was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned forward and sniffed Caedmon's collar, deeply, deliberately, with the unself-conscious thoroughness of a young wolf cataloging a scent he intended to keep. "You smell right," Wynne announced. Like this settled the matter entirely. Caedmon let out a sound that was half laugh, half something else entirely. His hand came up, hovered near the boy's face, trembling. Wynne looked at the hand, then at the man attached to it. Then he closed the distance himself, stepping forward and pressing his small body against his father's chest. Caedmon's arms closed around him, carefully at first, like he was holding something made of glass, then tighter, pulling the boy against him, one hand cradling the back of his dark curls, his face buried in his son's hair. Seren watched from 3 feet away, tears streaming down her face, and felt the bond flood with something so vast and luminous it nearly knocked her off her knees. Not just love, recognition. The bone-deep cellular certainty of pack-finding pack, of a fracture sealed, of a family that had existed in pieces finally becoming whole. Wynne pulled back first, his small hands braced against Caedmon's shoulders. "Your eyes are leaking," he observed with clinical interest. Caedmon laughed. A real laugh, wet and broken and beautiful. "Yes," he said, "they do that sometimes. Mamas do too." Wynne glanced at Seren, then back at Caedmon, and seemed to arrive at some private 4-year-old conclusion about the nature of adults and their leaking eyes. "Are you going to live with us now?" Caedmon looked at Seren over their son's head. The question in his eyes was not a king's question, it was a man's. Uncertain and hopeful and terrified of the answer. "Yes," Seren said. "He is." Wynne nodded, satisfied. Then he wriggled free of his father's arms with the abruptness of a child whose emotional bandwidth had been fully spent, and announced, "I want to show you my stick fortress." Caedmon stood, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, and followed his son into the garden. Seren watched them go, the enormous man and the tiny boy, their dark heads bent together over a pile of sticks and leaves, arranged with the architectural ambition of a 4-year-old who had never once doubted his own engineering abilities. Caedmon listened as Wynne explained the structural integrity of the leaf roof. He asked questions, serious questions, delivered with the same focused attention he gave his counsel. Wynne answered with the supreme confidence of a master builder addressing a novice. And Seren stood on the step, her hand over her mouth, her shoulders shaking with silent tears, and understood something she had never allowed herself to believe. She deserved this, not because she had earned it, not because she had suffered enough, or sacrificed enough, or proved herself useful enough. She deserved it because she was here, because she was alive, because the orphan girl who had spent her whole life making herself small and invisible and indispensable was allowed to take up space, was allowed to want things, was allowed to have a family that wanted her back. She had spent her entire life believing that love was something you earned by being useful, that if she stopped being helpful, she would stop being wanted, that nobody could become somebody only through service, through silence, through relentless, exhausting self-erasure. She had been wrong. She was wanted, not for what she could do, but for who she was. By a man who had searched for her without ever stopping. By a son who had dreamed of a forest and something howling. By a life that had been waiting for her to stop running long enough to claim it. Seren sat down on the step, wrapped her arms around her knees, and let herself cry. Not from grief, not from relief, from the overwhelming, terrifying, glorious recognition that she was finally home. In the garden, Wynne placed a stick in his father's hand and said, very seriously, "You can build the tower, but it has to be taller than yours." Caedmon studied the stick. Taller than me? Taller than everything. Caedmon smiled at his son, that same unguarded, devastating smile from the courtyard, and placed the first stick with the careful precision of a man who intended to get this right. The transition was neither smooth nor simple. Kingdoms do not quietly absorb the news that their king has a secret mate and a 4-year-old heir. The Northern Reach whispered. The court stared. Nobles who had spent years positioning their daughters as potential queen consorts swallowed their ambitions with varying degrees of grace. Aldrich Voss was tried, convicted, and stripped of his title. His trade routes were redistributed. His name became a cautionary tale about the cost of treating people as chess pieces. Seren weathered the scrutiny with more composure than she'd expected. The whispers stung, but they didn't wound, because every evening she returned to chambers where a man who happened to be king pulled her close and asked about her day with a sincerity that made the rest of the world shrink to background noise. Wynne adapted with the resilience unique to children. He explored the lodge, then later the palace at Dunkero, with wide-eyed wonder and absolutely no sense of appropriate boundaries. He wandered into council meetings and asked questions about grain tariffs. He befriended the kitchen staff and the stable hands and a very old wolfhound named Bracken who followed him everywhere with mournful devotion. He called Theron Uncle Theron within a week. And the beta, who had maintained an impeccable facade of stoic professionalism for 15 years, was seen sitting cross-legged on the floor of the nursery, building a stick fortress of considerable structural ambition. Caedmon learned fatherhood the way he learned everything, with intensity, with focus, and with a number of spectacular mistakes. He read Wynne the wrong bedtime story and was corrected with withering 4-year-old disdain. He misjudged the appropriate volume for indoor voices and was shushed by his own son. He carried the boy on his shoulders through the halls of Dunkero, and when a senior advisor raised an eyebrow at the sight, Caedmon raised one back with considerably more authority. At night, he slept deeply, peacefully, with Seren pressed against his side, and the bond humming between them like a low, constant song. Some nights he woke in the dark and lay still, listening to her breathing, and felt the quiet, staggering gratitude of a man who understood exactly how close he had come to losing this. Some mornings, Seren woke before dawn and found him already gone from the bed. She would find him in Wynne's room, sitting in the chair beside the small bed, watching his son sleep. He never explained. He didn't need to. She understood. He was learning the shape of the years he'd missed by watching the boy they'd made, memorizing the face that carried his eyes and her stubbornness, and something entirely, irreplaceably, Wynne's own. One evening, months after the move to Dunkero, Seren found the two of them in the garden. Wynne was explaining, with the elaborate patience of someone addressing a very slow student, the correct way to arrange sticks for maximum fortress stability. Caedmon was listening with a seriousness that would have been comical if it hadn't been so deeply, achingly genuine. "The leaf goes on last," Wynne instructed. "It's the most important part." Why is it the most important part? Caedmon asked. Because it holds everything together. Cadman looked up and found Seren in the doorway. Their eyes met. He smiled. That unguarded, heart-stopping smile that she had once seen him give a stranger's child in a courtyard, not knowing the child was his. But now he knew. Now it was deliberate, chosen, earned. Seren smiled back. She crossed the garden, sat down in the grass beside them, and picked up a stick. Wynne handed her a leaf without comment, his small face absorbed in the work. Caedmon's arms settled around her shoulders, warm and solid and unhurried. The three of them sat together in the fading light, building something small and imperfect and entirely theirs. And for the first time in 5 years, no one was running.